Hello, my dearios, my darlings, and welcome back to the Ages of Chaos, as it seems to have become christened. Welcome back indeed to what is probably going to be quite a long one, actually. After the publication of The Lost and the Damned and Slaves to Darkness, there was kind of a transitional period as Games Workshop was kind of finding its feet, and there were lots of specialist games released around this era. And they were basically, because the company was really taking off at this point, they were doing more or less what they're doing now. Now that the company has had this renaissance, they were just flung everything at the wall to see what stuck. So you got loads of specialist games coming out, which became iconic in the years to come. One of those game systems was the Epic or Space Marine game system, which was a scaled down version of 40k. So originally it was called Adeptus Titanicus, and it was the first system in which the background and the imagery for the really big apocalyptic war engines was established. The things like the Titans, the Demon engines, all of that stuff. It was established that, for reasons best known to themselves, the various races and species of the 40k universe have a habit of building very big and unwieldy walking engines of destruction, which would likely, in any real terms, building a single one of them would probably take the resources of an entire planet and the history of an entire civilized species to create. But there we go. Adeptus Titanicus, as it was back then, it had various different editions. It was very popular indeed. But one of the later editions, which I believe it was the third edition of Adeptus Titanicus, was called Space Marine. And what Space Marine introduced, it was around that time that it started being referred to as the Epic gaming system, for whatever reason, best known to themselves. I imagine because the whole point of the game system was that because the miniatures were so small, you could actually wage truly epic apocalyptic battles of the kind that you couldn't in the 40k systems back then, which were more skirmish based. But it was around the time that things were transitioning. It was sort of in the early days of Second Ed 40k that this game system came out. And with this game system were numerous boxed sets and army books and whatnot that detailed the backgrounds and the rules for particular races. And one of the most obscure and unusual was a book called Renegades. Now, Renegades is very odd. It's not really a book, for one thing. It's very cheaply produced. Renegades was a box set that had loads of specialist cards and templates and data entries and whatnot in it, but it also had a rules book, which was not a book, it was a pamphlet. It was literally something, it was just all paper, black and white, something that was basically just rushed off of you could rush it off of a home printer and make a better job of it, basically. But what was interesting about it is that it started to mark the transition in terms of the background from Rogue Trader and the Realms of Chaos into more or less what we know today as the background of the Chaos Space Marine Legions, and also of the Eldar, or the Eldari as they are now. That's the weird thing about the book. It actually includes the rules and background for the Epic gaming system for two of my favourite armies, which are the Eldar and the Chaos Space Marines, or just Chaos as they were back then. One of the most interesting things about the book is that it details background that is not detailed in the Slaves to Darkness or The Lost and the Damned. It marks a transitional period where the background is really crystallizing for Chaos and starting to become more developed, more certain. It only deals with 4 of the Chaos Space Marine Legions, and they are the cult, what would become known as the Cult Legions, so the World Eaters, the Death Guard, the Thousand Sons, and the Emperor's Children. Interestingly, this is where you get the background for the Primarchs of these legions, because the Primarchs of these legions are obviously playable entities in this system. They are actually entities that you can play with for the first time in any gaming system, because back then the Primarchs were so powerful, the Demon Primarchs were so powerful that you couldn't represent them in the 40k system. They were like demigods, you know? And in this system, they're massive. They're so immense they can crush like a rhino or an armoured tank underneath their feet quite easily and sweep aside entire squadrons, battalions of infantry with just like a single sweep of their talons. But it's really fascinating because for many of them, this is the first time that their background has been established. You get certain details in this background that you didn't get in the Realms of Chaos books, and also their imagery. In the Realms of Chaos books, they're not really described as such. You only get vague hints as to what they look like. Here they're depicted. I mean, there are miniatures for them. As crude as they were back then, there are actually miniatures that detailed what they look like in very crude form, almost like symbolic form, and details of which have been carried over into their present day manifestations, although they have been changed a great deal. Back then, they were wholly demonic. They had made, back then, becoming a demon prince or a demon primarch meant that you totally abandoned all of the your physical form. Everything that defined you as a mortal entity was gone. So these entities, these miniatures, are entirely demonic. If you look at Angron, for example, Angron is like the devil. He is like a classic demon in the sense that he has horns, he has wings, he doesn't have any armor or anything like that. He's just a demonic entity. Mortarion he is very, very much the image of the Grim Reaper, which of course he couldn't be in his present day manifestation, because we already have that entity in the form of the Necron Catan, the Nightbringer, which has already been established as the inspiration for that image, if you like. So it's fascinating to me. It's fascinating that these are the early depictions of the Demon Primarchs. The only one that isn't really very different from how he's presented in the present day is Fulgrim. Fulgrim looks pretty much like he does in the present day artwork. The present day artwork makes him more interesting. It makes him more ornate, and it makes him more attractive, interestingly. It makes him more beautiful. But he's pretty much as he appears back then. The one that's changed, the two that have changed the most, arguably, are Mortarion, who has become, he's much more like he was as a mortal Primarch. He's got, I mean, the version of Mortarion that appears in Renegades doesn't have any armor at all, and you can't see his face. He's entirely cowled, and he is much more mythic. He's much more mythological. And Magnus the Red looks technically nothing like the present day miniature in 40k, nothing like it, and that's a very good thing, because the portrayal of Magnus the Red back then was not entirely fitting, to be perfectly honest. He looks like a sort of squat goblinoid entity with a big red beard and a single eye set in his forehead. It doesn't really work. It doesn't portray the majesty of Magnus the Red very well, let's put it that way. But yeah, this book, it's very obscure, it's very difficult to find, because it is just made of paper, so most, unless you can get the boxed set on eBay somewhere, the book is, you know, it's been ripped, it's been stained, it's come apart at the seams because it's only stapled together. Very difficult to find. My version, which I bought from a friend yonks ago when I was still at school, it's just coming apart. There's hardly anything left of it. But it's a fascinating read. It's a fascinating read to see what was established back then, but also what changed, particularly from the Realms of Chaos onward, how these characters, these legions, and the presence of chaos in the 40k setting changed. And another thing that the book establishes is how things like demon engines work, how chaos titans are removed from their imperial counterparts. You know, how they are these ancient, warp transformed, demonically infested entities that are more like organic creatures. They're more like living entities than their imperial counterparts, and they're also archaic. The fact that these entities are from a bygone age, that's how they differ from their imperial counterparts quite significantly. You have established here the backgrounds and the imagery for very iconic war engines like the Brass Scorpion, for example, which still exists now, for things like the Death Dealer, the Cauldron of Blood, and all of that sort of thing. Khorne, interestingly, Khorne absolutely dominates this book. He absolutely dominates, as he did for a long time. It's established that Khorne has more in the way of demon engines and demon forges than most of the other Chaos Gods, because the industry of war and the technology of war is one of his more obscure aspects. He actually really loves technology, Khorne, because of course the history of technology is indeed the history of warfare by and large. So that's fascinating. That's really interesting. And what's particularly fascinating is that a lot of this background then carries over to what comes later. What happens with the advent of Second Ed 40k is the game becomes, although it is a sprawling mess of a game that takes, if you're going to play a decently sized game of Second Ed 40k, it takes a day at least. It's very difficult to play, very complex. It's still much more refined than Rogue Trader was. Rogue Trader was very much a role-playing game that has been sort of smushed together, merged and melded with a tabletop experience. Second Ed 40k is more of a skirmish. It's more of a sort of wide-scale skirmish game. It is more competitive in that regard, and it's slightly more refined. Not much, but slightly more refined. And what you got was the very first codices. At this point, you got the very first codices, and the first one was the Space Wolf Codex of all things, quickly followed by, I believe, the Orcs, the Eldar Chaos, the Imperial Guard, Space Marines, the Angels of Death, the Tyranids, and so on and so forth. But the Second Ed Chaos Codex changed a lot. It changed a hell of a lot. At this point, what they really wanted to do, because up until this point, the dynamic of Chaos was that the Chaos Space Marine Legions and the Forces of Chaos were predominated by the agendas of their gods. They were saturated demonically, they were lunatic, they were possessed. The gods determined what they did and how they worshipped and how they occurred, by and large. Whereas the Second Ed Chaos Codex does something very, very, very different, which is, it's actually intentional. What I love about the Second Ed Chaos Codex and about the army books from this era in general is that they include designer's notes, so you get to see what they intended, what they were trying to do with these books. And the Second Ed Chaos Codex really attempts to crystallize what the Chaos Space Marine Legions are. For one thing, it removes the emphasis. Back in Rogue Trader, Chaos armies were not just Chaos Space Marine armies. They were these massive polyglot forces of demons, of cultists, of beastmen, of mutants, of monsters, and Chaos Space Marines all smushed together. So they looked like explosions in a paint and miniatures factory on the tabletop. They were just all over the place. They lacked focus. So what they tried to do with the Second Ed Chaos Space Marine Chaos Codex was provide focus by emphasizing the Chaos Space Marine Legions, which is what people largely like to play. Cultists were in there and demon armies were in there, but they were sort of like appendix army lists. The focus was the Chaos Space Marine Legions, and what they really tried to do was remove them from the Chaos Gods to a certain degree. The Chaos Gods were obviously there and are obviously a significant part of the background, but they aren't the be-all and end-all. They add impetus and flavour and a sort of Lovecraftian element. What they really try to do with this book is emphasise that each of the Chaos Space Marine Legions has their own agendas, and they have their own histories and their own legacies and their own modus operandi. So the legions that were just given, like lip service back in the Realms of Chaos books, that didn't have any full background, are powerfully fleshed out here. You have, for the first time ever, you have the full background for the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Black Legion, the Alpha Legion, and the Word Bearers. You have, for the first time, mention of their Primarchs, where they come from, what they're doing. What they really try to emphasize in this book is that the Chaos Space Marines are ancient Reavers. They're from another time, they're from another era. They are entities that have existed for God knows how many years or centuries from their own perspectives because of the time-distorting qualities of the Eye of Terror. And they have come back, essentially. That through various means they've broken out into the material universe and are raiding and pillaging and wreaking the most unholy havoc upon the Imperium and also the other species of the 40k universe. What I really love in this book is the way it establishes that not many Imperial citizens know that they even exist. Even some of the Space Marine legions at this point don't know that they exist. Their existence is kept under lock and key by the Inquisition, because knowledge of their existence would be enough to foment panic, but also maybe to turn Imperial citizens to the worship of chaos. So they are like this mysterious, unholy, pillaging force from the depths of hell. It also establishes that fighting the Chaos Space Marines is very different from fighting any other force in the 40k universe, because you're not just fighting for your survival, you're fighting for your soul. If you are killed by the Chaos Space Marines, then your soul is forfeit. Your soul will go to the Chaos powers and will go to feed them, and that's a very terrifying thing. But what I really like is, if you don't want a Chaos Space Marine army that worships one of the Chaos Gods or any of the Chaos Gods, you don't have to have it. You've got very secular legions like the Night Lords, who are totally secular. They make use of the Chaos powers. They don't venerate them, but they acknowledge their existence and they enter into pacts with them for their own agendas. But they don't. They are entirely scornful of faith and religious worship. They're just sadists. They are these hideous, warped, monstrous sadists from beyond time and space. You have the Iron Warriors, who they're not devout, but they do worship the Chaos powers in the interest of mutual benefit. And you have the Alpha Legion, whose loyalties are odd. Their loyalties are very vague at this point. Whether they venerate the Chaos powers or not is difficult to determine, which I really like. You also have the total opposite of that in terms of the cult legions, the Death Guard, the Thousand Sons, the Emperor's Children, and the World Eaters, who are monotheistic. They're devout to a particular Chaos God power. And then you have the Word Bearers and the Black Legion to a lesser extent, both of whom venerate the Chaos powers as a pantheon, but in very different ways. You have these varying flavors of chaos cropping up. With regards to the cult legions, their background is changed quite significantly and elaborated enormously, particularly with regards to the Thousand Sons. The Thousand Sons are probably the one that's changed the most, because this is the first time you have the establishment of things like the Rubric of Ahriman, and the first time you have Rubric Marines, that is the Automata, which have now become so iconic of Thousand Sons. Before this codex, they didn't exist. That portion of the background didn't exist. The reason it does here is because the writers are trying to portray different extremes of Chaos Space Marine through the different legions and their characters. So, for the Thousand Sons, you have Ahriman for the first time. Ahriman, who is not devout, who doesn't worship chaos at all, but is a puppet of chaos, contrasted to the likes of Khan the Betrayer, who is established for the first time in this book, who is so devout that he's lost everything. He actually doesn't have any personality at all beyond what Khorne gifts to him. He's actually just an avatar of Khorne's aspects. He doesn't have any personality beyond that. And those are two of the extremes. And in between them, you have characters like Fabius Bile, who is, again, secular. Almost entirely secular, does not worship the powers of chaos, but has his own peculiar agendas. And Abaddon the Despoiler, for the first time ever. You have established the arch-messiah of chaos, Abaddon the Despoiler. And also for the first time, you have this notion that there is a building threat within the Eye of Terror, thanks to Abaddon. The centuries of infighting, although it does still occur to a certain degree, have ended, and Abaddon is launching these Black Crusades, which are weakening the Imperium sequentially. They are achieving particular goals and gradually, over a period of centuries and even millennia, weakening the infrastructure of the Imperium and also of reality itself. So you have that dynamic introduced as well, which is really interesting. One of the things I love about this book is that it removes the emphasis from the four cult legions. Although they are very prominent, they're not the be-all and end-all. You actually have the Prime Legion being established as the Black Legion. for the first time ever, the Black Legion have become the preeminent power within the Eye of Terror. They are the biggest of the Chaos Space Marine legions. They're the most organized, they're the most coherent, because Abaddon does not suffer fools. He does not suffer challenges to his authority, essentially. So he has gradually built this power base within the Eye of Terror, whereby he can command fleets and legions beyond the scale of what even the original Space Marine legions could dream of. He is the preeminent power within the Eye, and that's really fascinating. That's at this point in time, that is absolutely fascinating. You also have that new model, which was at the time that new model of Abaddon the Despoiler, which is now so archaic, and it should have been retired such a long time ago. But back then, revolutionary. It was a really cool miniature. At this point, it doesn't even look like a Chaos. It doesn't even look like a Chaos miniature. It's too clean looking. It's far too clean looking, and way too dinky, way too small. I mean, for my personal journey with Games Workshop, this is really my entry point. The Chaos Codex was the second one I ever bought, the first one being the Eldar Codex, the second Ed Eldar Codex. The Chaos book, it was my introduction, really. It was what turned me, really. It was that book that turned me from an Eldar player to a Chaos player, because it was just so fascinating. It was just so fascinating to me back then. I absolutely adore that book. Although it's very crude by present-day standards, it has a lot of heart in it. There's so much hobbyism in it. There's so much enthusiasm for this background, because again, in many instances, it was the first time this was set down, and it had a dynamic behind it. If you read the production notes by Andy Chambers and Jarvis Johnson, they really wanted to do something with this book. They wanted to crystallize Chaos. They wanted to give it a dynamism beyond what it had initially. They wanted to make something very special here, and it does succeed to a certain degree. It was a very wonderful book to play with back in the day. It also has lots of flavour stuff. Like, for example, beyond the main Chaos Space Marine army list, there are 2 tertiary army lists, which are loads of fun. The Chaos Cultist army list is great, and that it's an appendix army list that has Chaos Cultists and Beastmen and mutants and lots of stuff ported over from the Imperial Guard. And then you have the Demon World army list. And the Demon World army list is really weird. It's the list that allows you to build an army of demons, but also of just the stuff that you can port over from the fantasy battle game as it was back then. You could have trolls, and you could have Chaos Knights and Chaos Warriors in 40k. So weird, but so brilliant. I love that. I absolutely love that. And what I find really peculiar is, if you look at, say, the Thousand Sons Codex now, it's going back that way. It's actually returning back to those days when you could port stuff over from the fantasy battle game. So just as back then you could have Beastmen and Dragon Ogres and all of that weirdness, now you can have Zarngor and Mutalith Vortex Beasts and whatnot. I mean, it's really cool. I love that cyclical nature of these products. It's really, really cool. So this is my entry point. This is when I came in, and it's a wonderful book. My copy is very tattered, very dog-eared, because it's gone all over the world with me. I used to take it on holiday and all over the place. It is actually falling to bits, but it's still a coherent and very readable book. A lot has changed since those days. A lot has changed. But it's fascinating to me. It's fascinating to see how much has changed and not changed, how much has sustained since those days. It's still fun to read, even now. Beyond sentiment, beyond nostalgia, it's still actually a really fun read, and well worth picking up for the sake of history, if nothing else. For the sake of history. Alongside that book, you also had a new book in what was then the fantasy battle system, which had moved on significantly since the days of Slaves to Darkness and The Lost and the Damned. I think at that point we were on we were on Fantasy Battle 3rd edition, I think, at that point, so that game had moved on quite significantly. You had another Realms of Chaos boxed set. This book and this box set was significantly removed from what went before, but at the same time had a lot ported over. So it's not just a book, it's a big boxed set that is largely just full of cards. Because the Chaos armies back then had a lot of unique abilities, a lot of unique spells, a lot of curses, a lot of blessings and whatnot, and you used cards back then to denote them. And some of them had like specialist templates as well. So what you have is a Chaos army that's very much like it was back in the Realms of Chaos books. It's just everything all thrown together. You've got demons, you've got dragons, you've got dragon ogres, you've got beast men, you've got mortal chaos warriors, all just thrown together in these big polyglot armies. And you have these random elements as well, which are determined by gifts of chaos. They're cards that you give to your miniatures, which of course makes sculpting miniatures rather difficult, because they could change during the battle, which is a bit weird. They can actually change during the battle. In terms of background, the book is not that interesting because it doesn't change a great deal. It really does not change a great deal. The only thing the book really does, a lot of stuff is ported over from Slaves to Darkness and Lost and the Damned, a lot of stuff. But the only thing it really does, it simplifies the rules a bit, so you don't have these die 100 tables, but it also diminishes the conflicts between the Chaos powers. So at this point it's actually very possible to have a Chaos army that consists of a Chaos Lord of Khorne riding a dragon, leading Fiends of Slaanesh and Demonettes of Slaanesh and Horrors of Tzeentch and Chaos Warriors marked by Nurgle. It's very possible. You have this sort of polyglot quality at this point. This book is not very fondly remembered, it has to be said, because it's not very good. It's quite, you can make some killer army lists from it, there's no doubt, but the armies lack flavour, they lack coherence, because it is just these bits and pieces from all over the place. And if you look at the first battle that's fought with it in White Dwarf, which I believe is an army of chaos everything, basically. It's a Chaos Lord of Slaanesh riding a converted dragon that's leading Pink Horrors, Demonettes of Slaanesh, there's a Chaos Wizard of Nurgle in it, there are Chaos Knights and Warriors marked by Khorne in it. It's a mess. Fighting dwarves. It's just all over the place. I mean, it's a powerful army. It's a really powerful and kind of fun army in many respects, because you can have things like Chaos Spawn, you've got spells that can make Chaos Spawn, you've got spells that can turn enemies into Pink Horrors of Tzeentch, you've got spells that can summon demons and stuff like that. It's kind of fun, I kind of like that, but it's so lacking in coherence. One thing you do have, which is interesting in this book, is more of an establishment of the status of chaos in the old world. You have this notion established, for example, that chaos comes from the north. It comes from the far north, where the polar gate leads into the realms of chaos. You have the establishment that there are northern tribes, for example. There are these tribes of warriors that are dedicated to the chaos powers. This is the first time that that's established to any great degree, which of course will go on to inform how chaos manifests in the old world from that point on. So, interesting, I would say. An interesting book. An interesting book, but not necessarily an essential one. It's not the best, but it has a certain naivety that makes it engaging. Beyond that, not much happening in the old world regarding chaos. Certainly not as much or as interesting as what's happening in 40k at this point. And it definitely shows. Anyone who was around at this point with the release of the Second Ed Chaos Codex will be able to tell you everyone was collecting a Chaos Legion back then. Absolutely everyone. Because it was so much fun. And the miniatures range was excellent. But yes, that's what was happening back then. The next video is going to be an interesting one, because it really is a massive transitional period. I will warn you for now, there is, although we endeavour here at the Fluffenhammer to maintain a sort of positive outlook on things, there are certain eras of Games Workshop where it's very difficult to do that, and as a result, these videos are going to be a little bit more critical and a little bit more negative, and the next one will probably be that, I'm afraid to say. because in the next one we're going to look at the transition from 2nd ed to 3rd ed and the original 3rd ed Chaos Codex. We're actually going to look at that, which is, I will say, not very fondly remembered, and with very good reason. In fact, it's almost forgotten. A lot of people don't even include it in their collections. It's so bad. But that will be interesting. It will be interesting to see what they got wrong, why did it go wrong, and what was the reaction of people down here, people in the fan base. So until then, my dears, bye-bye!